Hi Crystal, welcome and many thanks for taking the time to participate in our research project. Dr. Crystal Legacy is Senior Lecturer in Urban Planning at the University of Melbourne. Crystal writes about the politics of transport planning and citizen participation in Canada and Australia. She's also written extensively about strategic plan making and more broadly about governance of urban and infrastructure development. Thank you, Crystal.
Crystal, thank you again for your time. My name is Juan Cristaldo and I work at CIDI, the Research and Innovation Center at the Architecture School in the Faculty of the National University of Asunción. To begin with, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the project we're working on called Infraestructura and Territorial Transformations in Paraguay from 1960 to 2014. The fundamental premise of our project is that large infrastructural initiatives have the capacity to reconfigure, either for better or worse, vast territories in short periods of time. Interestingly, infrastructural projects in Paraguay and around the world are often considered a question of analysis for engineers, economists, or politicians, and the professional inputs of planners, urban designers, or architects are often not considered. We hope to address this shortcoming through our work. In the specific case of our project, we focus on 3 regions in South America. The first one is the Triple Frontier, a region comprising Ciudad del Este in Paraguay, Foz do Iguaçu in Brazil, and Puerto Iguaçu in Argentina, transformed by the Itaipú Dam and the Friendship Bridge project between the 1960s and 1980s. The second region is the Yacyretá Lake, a binational region comprising Encarnación in Paraguay and Posadas in Argentina, along a number of other cities, transformed by the Yacyretá Dam project in the 1990s. And finally, the Paraguayan Central Chaco, where we are studying 4 communities that together constitute the urban center of the region. These cities are called Philadelphia, Loma Plata, Neuland, and Mariscal Estigarribia. And they have been transformed by basically a road and bridge project. One of the key aspects of our research is the international case studies. Specifically, we're looking for cases around the world which may help us to reflect about the problems we face here in Paraguay. We are interested in studying infrastructure projects that have altered or may come to alter soon large cities and extended territories. We are interested both in positive or negative examples, things that can inspire us or things to avoid. We are particularly interested in the spatial dimensions of infrastructure projects and how it relates to planning processes and institutional frameworks. Today, we are very interested in talking to you about 2 recent transport mega projects in Melbourne, the East-West Link and the Westgate Tunnel, that are subject of your research. But first, we would like to learn more about yourself and your research. So to begin, what interests you most about large transport infrastructure planning? What challenges or issues surrounding contemporary urban transports motivates your work?
Okay, thank you for that and for the introduction and for the invitation. This is really fun and cool. Now, what motivates me with my work? Well, my PhD research was looking at strategic planning and plan making. And it became, and through that work, I was interested in deliberative processes, so how politicians, planners, and the public engage around the challenges they face in their city and how they might develop policy in response to that. But I became acutely aware of the fact that producing a plan is one thing, but actually implementing it is something quite different. And so when we move from plan making into plan implementation and infrastructure investment decisions and priorities, there seems to be a disconnection between what our policy ambition might be, and as they're reflected in the plan, and what the investment priorities tend to look like. And so initially I was very interested in the gap between plan making and investment priority decision making, and I saw that there was a governance gap reflected in that, in the fact that those decisions don't seem to coalesce and align always. So my work is motivated on understanding that governance gap, and I tend to do that via sort of foregrounding the role of the citizen in those processes, in part because the gap is identified via citizen backlash and community conflict and resistance that occurs in response to the fracture from what the plan initially had said it would do. So that was my initial motivation for engaging in the kind of infrastructure planning work that I've been doing now over the last few years. And I'm interested in citizens' participation, but I'm also interested in questions of politics and how politics is performed by the different players. As though politics occurs as a dance between respective players, politics and politicking and politicization is often constituted by the context, and the context is always changing. So I try to map that. And then from a more sort of theoretical perspective, I'm also interested in questions of conflict and how politics helps bring to light the different ways in which conflict happens and shapes infrastructure planning, essentially. So I'm sorry if that was a very long response, but yeah, that's what motivates my work.
Perfect, thank you very much. A second question would be, transport planning is traditionally a technocratic activity, but your approach to this field from a socially grounded perspective. How do you approach your research work and what does it entail?
Okay, so is this a question about methods? Okay, yeah. So with respect to methods, what I previously in my research training as a PhD student, I did research that was retrospective. So I looked at plans and infrastructure projects that had already come to light and took a more sort of historical, institutional perspective. But because I became really interested in the East-West link and now the Westgate Tunnel project, these were projects that were happening now. And so I had to learn very quickly what ethnographic research looks like. And I'm not a trained ethnographer, so I feel very uncomfortable with that as a title. So another way in which you might describe my work methodologically is also participatory action research through a critical lens. And so what I do is I embed myself in the campaigns surrounding infrastructure projects that are being proposed. I also engage in formal processes of decision making. So I attend public hearings and, analyze public submissions. So I embed myself both in the formal and informal spaces in which citizens engage with these projects. I also do a lot of policy analysis and, institutional analysis, and I do that through like a critical discourse approach. As a critical researcher, I think it's really important to always ask the question of, where does power lie, who wins, who loses, who benefits, and what knowledge is at play. So that kind of colors my methods. And also another part of my work is that I also am a subject of my own research. So as a transport academic, and as I wouldn't call myself an activist, but I feel like I'm starting to move into that space a little bit. I'm also really interested in the role of the academic planner and the academic transport planner specifically in these processes as a way of shaping the discourses. So I am myself and the community of scholars that I'm surrounded by are also part of the research work. So I do a lot of interviews. I interview politicians if I can get access to them. I interview policymakers, so planners, if I can get access to them. And I do a lot of work interviewing and observing community groups and citizens. I also do a lot of media analysis, which is historical, and I think that's probably it. And a lot sort of informal. A lot of the work I do is quite informal. So, for instance, I'm going to a community rally on Sunday, and while I won't be walking around with an audio recorder, I'd be taking lots of notes about the kind of things people are saying and how they're engaging with each other.
Fantastic. Thanks, Crystal. It's really interesting to hear how the approach to your research has evolved from PhD studies to now and continues to evolve. I'd like to ask a question that turns us towards the East-West Link and Westgate Tunnel projects in Melbourne. I was wondering if you could tell us a little about these two projects. Both were conceived in 2008 as part of an integrated east-west road corridor connecting the established eastern suburbs of Melbourne to the rapidly growing western suburbs. But both projects have since advanced in quite separate ways. What informs these projects in your view, and in what ways are they similar, and in what ways might they be different?
Different. Oh, right. That's such a big question.
It is,
James.
and we can break it down. Maybe we just start if you give us your take on the project.
Yeah. Okay. Look.
A little description on them.
Okay. So these projects were born out of a study that came to light in 2008. So they didn't arise from a plan. They came from a study, and a study about an east-west corridor. So not about metropolitan Melbourne or about Victoria, with a specific focus on a corridor which the politicians and planners at the time were believing was probably going to be problematic and needed to be addressed in terms of where our freight movement aligns and how people get in and out of the city. So the East-West Link was an 18-kilometer corridor. And the Westgate Tunnel project, which is the project that's currently being proposed and contracts just signed this week, was an element of that and was conceived as part of the Truck Action Plan, although the project in its current form is much bigger than that. The projects came about, so the projects then informed a plan, the Victorian Transport Plan, and immediately these projects were controversial. So citizen community groups started to protest them as being not an appropriate response to our transport mobility challenges in that corridor. And so they were very politically sensitive projects for politicians to engage with, particularly in the lead up to elections. So in 2010, we had a change in government. Up to that point, we had a Labor government that did the study, and a Liberal government who eventually got elected to do public transport, because that was what was palatable politically, and also that's what also was reflected in our metropolitan strategies up to that point. So the plans. But of course the government was won, and the decision changed to prioritize stage 2 of the East-West Link 18-kilometer corridor. And that was very unpopular, and then that decision was defeated in 2014. We got a Labor government who now has decided to build a project which is a much bigger project to what they had proposed to do in the lead up to the 2014 election. So these projects are political projects, essentially, in my view. They're political insofar as the alternatives to those projects are not being properly conceived and rigorously analyzed with respect to the road-based solution to the east-west problems. So we have a couple of public transport solutions that could be proposed, one of which is being built called Melbourne Metro 1. There's also a Melbourne Metro 2, which would provide us with a second crossing over the Maribyrnong River, which is where one of our big choke points occurs, which fractures in the west from the rest of metropolitan Melbourne, where the jobs and services are mostly located. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling, in part because it's a very complicated project and process.
You're describing it well. No,
okay.
No, I have another question here. And you mentioned before that the two projects are quite politically contentious.
Absolutely.
In your work, what strategies and tactics have you observed that the governments are using to take these projects out of the political realm? And I just wonder if you reflect on those.
Yeah.
There might be some parallels with projects in the Paraguayan case.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that may be of interest to you and what we try to bring to light as transport academics is the disconnect between what would constitute good transport planning versus what could constitute good politics. And unfortunately, we've got a lot of bad politics and a lot of bad planning happening at the same time, which makes these projects incredibly frustrating to deal with. So when I talk about bad planning, what I mean by that is there is often not a business case that's transparent. The cost-benefit analysis may be not favorable to the project, but the modelers might manipulate the data in such a way to make the project more favorable. They're not rigorously assessed against other alternatives. So the alternative might be an alignment alternative to the project, but it's not an alternative to the project. So an alternative could be a public transport solution, for instance, or a way to manage travel behavior as another solution. And so those are the kinds of things that we teach in planning, transport planning schools and in the classroom. So that's happening. And then we've got bad politics and good politics. So good politics, in my view, is, getting elected on a mandate to do X, Y, and Z, and then doing that. So at the very least, in the absence of a plan, we don't have a transport plan here in Victoria, which is astounding. So in the absence of an integrated transport plan, at the very least, we should be able to rely on the political cycles to deliver at least a political mandate and political legitimacy to support these projects. But what we've seen over a couple of changes in government now is that governments are very quick to change their minds, and they just use their, the fact that they are sovereign in that they were elected in their ability to make those changes happen. So that's part of the issue. And then the other ways in which governments seek to manipulate the politicization, that is to squash the politics out of these projects, is to sign contracts very, very quickly. And so by signing contracts, you then create this fear campaign that if you cancel contracts, then you create an environment where the foreign investors in the investment community will not want to play with the Victorian government or Victorians, and so that we'll lose investments and we'll lose infrastructure opportunities, and that will have an impact on our productivity, and then of course on jobs, which is always how these projects are often sold. It's job creating opportunities. So we're seeing quite a lot of that happening now here in Victoria, where the government is seeking to sign contracts, create an environment of certainty for the private sector. But of course, the private sector isn't stupid. They've been reading the news. And so what you need to also take consideration of are the clauses within these contracts that are signed. So if the government does change and the project is cancelled, how much money will the taxpayers be up for in terms of having to pay out these private consortiums? So this is the game in which transport planning is being played here in this state, and it's become very ugly and very contested. It says a potential threat. I don't know on your screen. I think you're fine.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask something to see if I got it right? So for what you're telling, Crystal, yeah. I think you're mentioning that there are two aspects. One is say that there is for one side we have a kind of a technical frailty or technical limitation or bad quality of the projects themselves, either by error or either by bad intention directly in the elaboration, the technical elaboration of the projects, and there is a second dimension in which, if I got it right, in a way, democratic debate is being substituted by a politic of what we call here hechos consumados, like consume facts. Like you sign a contract and then say, well, we have to stick to the contract because otherwise we'll be in bad shape. And that in a way, by saying that decisions have been made and contracts have been signed and budget has been allocated, you in a way bypass or you declare democratic debate to be impossible. I got it right?
Yeah, you're doing what Bent Fluthberg would describe as lock-in. You're locking the community into a particular trajectory by virtue of the steps that have been taken to embed this project to a point where it becomes an inevitability. Yeah. So, I mean, signing contracts and then, articulating the implications of canceling those contracts is one way to suppress the politics that might arise either from the community or from the opposition parties, which are always looking to politicize these projects, of course, for their own benefit, which is something that we always have to be very mindful of. So certainly this lock-in thing that happens with respect to these projects is a problem, and also misrepresentation of the facts, of the evidence. So going back to the issue of evidence-based planning, we have a lot of manipulation of the facts and an overreach in terms of the narrative that surrounds that. And I mean, us and myself and James was part of this as well, sat in on the formal process to assess the negative impacts of this project and the way in which the lawyers for the state government were framing the benefits of this project in terms of the language they were using to describe it in a very emotive way was a way to manipulate the independent panel that had to assess this project. And it was a very sinister and clever a way to do it. But the way in which the community, because the thing that's really interesting here about this context here in Victoria is that this kind of politicking around infrastructure planning is not new. And perhaps something that you should know, and I'm sure, and James certainly knows this, is that in the context of the East-West link, which was the project that was defeated at the 2014 election, that project itself has been defeated 3 times already. Over the course of 40 years. It's not a new project. It's what, a zombie project, right? So, and there's some effort to revive that project again. So what we have here is a community that is really attuned to the politics and the manipulation and how discourse can be used. So in studying the community's response to that, it's really quite interesting because what I see is that a movement away from just NIMBY politics and just emotive politics with respect to don't acquire my home or what about the children in terms of emissions. All of those things are incredibly important, but they're also the community incredibly politically savvy in terms of trying to manipulate the political discourse to achieve their own benefit, which is also equally interesting. So again, what we have around infrastructure planning in this state is a play between good and bad politics, depending upon where you sit, and a complete disregard for planning from all players. And it's really, really interesting, I think.
Crystal, your work also studies local governments and community groups working to resist projects, to either amend them in some way or to stop them outright. What strategies and tactics do these groups use to repoliticize transport planning, to face this project, and how is their work evolving?
So just to clarify, so in addition to the toll roads I follow here in Victoria, I also follow light rail projects in Canadian cities. So the groups I study are groups that are resisting projects, but also advocacy groups, so groups that are trying to get certain forms of infrastructure built. So it's a little bit more nuanced than just, groups that are just in opposition to it. And in part, one of the main strategies that these groups employ, particularly the groups that are in opposition, is an articulation of an alternative. They know that in order to be heard and to not be simply dismissed as NIMBY groups, they also have to offer a vision, their own vision for the city and an alternative to the project, in part because they understand that there is a problem. They just have a different interpretation and a different view on how that problem could be addressed. So these groups are incredibly astute and savvy in terms of being able to manage the kind of critiques they would, that they would be subject to in the media. Lefty ratbags, inner city elites, NIMBYs, to try to chart a different kind of narrative. So I went to a community meeting on Saturday, for example, in the West, and it was really interesting because the focus of that meeting was to stitch together the different campaign groups, because there's a number of tollway projects being proposed here. So there's a group in the Northeast, around the Northeast Link. There was a group associated with the East-West Link, and then, of course, the groups associated with the Westgate Tunnel project. And it was very interesting to see them negotiate how they might work together in terms of a broader coalition. And those discussions are just starting to happen. And I find that incredibly exciting. So again, that's another strategy, is to kind of see that even if they were to defeat this project, it doesn't mean the project will be defeated forever, or that it will stop another project that's equally sinister from emerging in their view. And so they're trying to find a way to kind of intervene in just the way in which we talk about transportation planning and problems, so that we can actually move the discourse away from trains versus tolls, which is how we how the problem is conceptualized here, to something that moves away from one or the other, one good, one bad, to just moving to a position where public transport becomes normalized as the priority for the, for metropolitan Melbourne, the first priority, and then road-based solutions being what we do if we can't deliver a public transport solution. And that's one of the big differences I see between my Australian case studies versus my Canadian case studies. In my Canadian case studies, they have normalized public transport. Public transport sits across the political spectrum, left and right. So the business community is fully engaged with public transport as a solution. Of course, there's raises other issues in terms of gentrification and other sort of economic ambitions that don't necessarily align with social justice ambitions around light rail transit, and that's a different discussion. But unfortunately here in Victoria, we're just not even there yet. We're still having a debate whether or not roads versus trains. The debate is couched in such polarizing ways. Yeah.
Just quick question to give kind of a broader illustration to our conversation now. You have mentioned that one of these projects have been defeated several times, and it has been 40 times in discussion. So, two sides. First, in your view, which are the shortcomings of the projects? Which are the problems that the project has? And on the other side, because that would necessarily be the rational question, I guess, is why it keeps coming back? Why this zombie keeps rising again?
Okay, I think I'll answer the second question first, because it's a little bit easier, I think. But it doesn't have a simple answer either. So we've got a plan called the 1969 Transport Plan, which has been around since 1969, and it was essentially a roads vision for Melbourne. And many of those roads were built, but what has happened is that not all roads were were connected. So we've got gaps in our network, and so there's a strong interest in connecting, filling in those gaps and completing the full network, right? So that's one thing, that's one aspect that's driving this. The other one is just automobility, the politics of automobility. We have a culture of automobility. People love their cars here. And so to move that, to shift that requires a full political economic analysis of automobility in terms of who the key stakeholders and interest groups are, in terms of those who are trying to reproduce that. And certainly that's an ongoing discussion. Right now, we're seeing the state and federal government get quite excited about autonomous vehicles, which is another way in which to lock in our trajectory of road building, because roads may be required for autonomous vehicles to run in the way that they're meant to run, I suppose. So there's the automobility issue, and there's also just, I've mentioned this a few times, but I'll kind of foreground it, the lack of vision and imagination in terms of what an alternative could look like. And I think that's fair enough. I mean, some folks who live out in the deep southeast or the deep north, are faced daily with a long commute. And so they would like to have a shorter commute. And so in their view, the only way in which that can be achieved is by widening the road, possibly, or creating another road. So they've never had to, they've never seen an opportunity for public transport to be extended. They don't see the role public transport plays in their lives. They just don't have that experience. And so in the absence of that, it's really easy to see that a large constituency, in Melbourne and Victoria just wouldn't vote for a party that is pro-public transport, because they don't see how it impacts them and their lives. And also these things take a long, long time to build. And so much of our network is incomplete in terms of public transport. So even if you were to vote pro-public transport and you live out in Cranbourne, you may not see that the benefits of that in your lifetime. I mean, these things are, so that's why that's the question. So I guess that's in response to your question about why this project keeps coming back. Okay, and also it's also a political motivation as well. I mean, from the Liberals' the Liberal Party would want to see the East-West link built because it's an opportunity for them to weaken the Labour Party because the Labour Party is their home, their base used to be in the West as well as in the inner city, but that base is now shifting because we're seeing the rise of the Greens Party, which is a party which is pro-public transport. So, I mean, that's one reason why the Liberal Party decided to lead with the East-West link in 2012, was in part by a political game to unsettle Labour's base. So what's wrong with this project? I mean, when it was first conceived in the 1970s, it was a surface project. So it was part of the urban renewal movement, which was quite popular in North American and Australian cities. You know, the Jane Jacobs stuff. And so in the last iteration of this project, it was a tunneled project. So it wasn't going to result in urban renewal, you know, the removal of, you know, wide swaths of land. But it was going to destroy a lot of parkland, and that was not a popular thing for Victorians. I mean, inner city parkland is really sensitive and important and worth defending and saving. There was also housing acquisitions, and people get really upset about housing acquisitions. I mean, that's one thing that Transurban has managed quite well with the Westgate Tunnel project, is to ensure that there were very few housing acquisitions, because that's one thing that helps galvanize opposition. And the other reason why this project is problematic is because it's an inner city toll road. Many cities around the world aren't building inner city roads anymore. They're building public transport to facilitate movement in and out of the CBDs and downtowns. And the other thing that's problematic is that it's a tolled road, in that it doesn't sit within the context of some kind of network demand management, whereby we're trying to manage people's use of roads by introducing tolls and congestion tax and things like that. This is a project that would be fully operated and therefore would benefit a private operator. So it seems like a real missed opportunity in terms of developing and generating new revenue streams that can be redistributed into hospitals, schools, and public transport. So there's also a major governance challenge that is really hard to kind of foreground because it's not sexy. People don't get excited about governance, but it is something that people are now starting to start to raise eyebrows around in terms of the inequity that produces, who's paying for tolls and who's not. And folks who are paying for tolls are often those who don't have access to jobs and services nearby where they live, and nor do they have an adequate alternative, i.e. public transport. So we're starting to see in other cities like Sydney, the inequity starting to produce and galvanize a political response by communities out in suburbs who were otherwise less politically engaged in transportation planning.
Super interesting. I guess I just wanted to summarize, because I feel that there were three super important points you touched. First is this idea of, in a way, the inertia of previous projects, in a way that whatever has been built has a super strong impact in whatever decision will be made in the future. You know, like in a way that there is a tendency to, you know, fill the gaps of whatever framework is already there. So I guess that's one aspect that I would recover from your talk right now. The second aspect will be that there is also a kind of a more conjunctural discussion on politics, you know, which party aligns to which tendency or whatever. So I guess that those are two different items of the conversation. And I guess the third that you just mentioned is this idea of infrastructure as a mechanism that can be either useful to use as a mean of richness redistribution or concentration, you know, depending on who pays the bill and who benefits or whatever. You know, it's basically a mechanism that brings money from somewhere to someone, and it's always useful to see, in a way, who can be potentially benefit in economic terms or who will pay the bill, in a way. So I guess these three aspects, you know, the inertia of the projects, of what has been built in the past, the conjunctural political discussion, and who pays and who gets economic benefits are three super relevant aspects of whatever project we are discussing. So thank you very much for bringing these aspects to attention. James, I'd like to ask you if you can make the next question, please.
Absolutely. Crystal, following on from your response to the previous question and some of what your research has been exploring more recently is this blurring of the lines between the public and private interests in transport planning in Melbourne. And some of what you touched upon before pointed towards the role of private actors. And in Melbourne, we have a large corporation who has a very influential role in planning the transport network. I was wondering if you could speak to some of the issues coming out of that nexus.
All right. Okay. So, yeah, excuse me. Sorry, I choked. That's what happens. So I mentioned transurban, I always choke. So, yeah, the blurring of the public and the private is nothing new. It's not a new thing. I mean, public-private partnerships has been a tool and an instrument employed by government to procure, deliver, operate public transport or transport and build infrastructure for a long, long time. What becomes problematic, though, and I think this is something that's happening here in Victoria, is the shaping of planning and policy by the private sector, and that not being named as being something that is happening. So that is something, you know, it's always easier to make a point like that appear more cogent when you've got a case study to play with that has an alternative story, which is the light rail projects in Canada, whereby much of that work is embedded in strategic planning over multiple decades. Business cases were produced, discussions with multiple tiers of government were had with respect to funding arrangements, and then a procurement process is put in place in order to bring the private sector on board to operate something, right? So it's a very clear series of steps. Now, what's happened here in Victoria is we've got this new thing called market-led proposals. So the private sector can come forward and propose a project that could be anything. I mean, it doesn't have to, it doesn't appear to have to align with a plan or a strategic ambition. And the reason why that I say that is because we don't have a plan in place in the first place. So these market-led proposals, when they're put forward, are then assessed through 5 stages and through a set of guidelines, which are relatively opaque, not transparent, and again, don't align well with not only a plan, but also the existing legislation, which is the Transport Integration Act. So the fact that there's no sort of clear lines of engagement with policy framework and existing legislation, and that these decisions are just occurring in parallel, but with no direct conversation with these other things, becomes really problematic. And it makes it, I mean, the average citizen would have no idea how to engage with that, let alone the transport academic who studies governance. You know, it's very, very difficult to understand what the motivations are and whose interests are being served. So we're only left to conclude that the interest being served is that of the private sector for their gain alone. And that's where the public and private relationship becomes highly problematic. So it's couched in terms of a partnership, and that's how it's described on government websites. But the relationship with the details of that partnership remain behind closed doors. And because politicians are not quick to have conversations and engage in public debates about project prioritization, nor are planners able to speak openly and frankly about the work that they do within the bureaucracy, it's really hard to know how these conversations occur and what the details are. So we rely quite a lot on investigative reporters here in Melbourne, you know, people who have, you know, connections, and you can pick up the phone and get people to like things, but in the absence of that, but beyond that, we just have no sense of who is really shaping our transportation planning. And that's the discourse. I mean, it sounds alarmist when I say it. I know it does sound like that, but that's the discourse that's coming through in the media reporting around these projects, that the public sector has lost control. And indeed, Auditor General reports on these projects, so independent third-party analysis on the processes of decision-making often come forward saying that the project was fraught, the process was fraught, and that the public sector didn't advise the ministry accordingly based on the evidence that they had within their remit to produce. So a lot of the blame appears to be directed onto the public sector, which is probably fair. I mean, the public sector and our governments have created the space for an entity like Transurban in the private sector to arise. But again, it's wagging fingers, pointing fingers on on one part of the problem without a full understanding of the whole suite of issues that are being played out.
Well, I was interested in knowing, and maybe as we're wrapping up the interview, on maybe a slightly more optimistic note, what are the prospects for recent innovations in governance in Melbourne? And we've had the introduction of the citizen juries process and also the Transport Integration Act. What are the prospects that they indicate a different direction for transport planning in Melbourne? And are you able to tell us a little bit about these results?
Okay, yes. Well, I've just published an article on citizens' juries looking at Infraestructura Victoria. We've got a third-party independent authority, statutory authority, called Infraestructura Victoria, which is tasked with doing research on, infrastructure funding arrangements, and they put in place a 30-year infrastructure plan, our strategy, that was released just last year. And as part of that work, they did a series of citizens' juries. And I'm quite critical of citizens' juries, in part because often consultation as it's used via government is to legitimize decisions. And it's also used as a way to manipulate and silence people who are dissenters. So people who might have an alternative view as to what the trajectory of Melbourne should be. So citizens' juries is one way to bring lay citizens together. And it's a really fabulous process. I mean, to bring lay citizens together to have a conversation about the future of Melbourne is really exciting. And for the people who are involved, it can be transformative. These people end up, writing to their MPs more regularly, or also maybe might pursue a political career themselves. So they're really interesting innovations, but we also always have to be critical and somewhat cynical of what the motivations underpinning these citizens' juries actually are in terms of what their purpose is and why have they arose at this particular point in time. In my view, transport planning and infrastructure planning has become so political that the government is trying to find ways to diffuse that. And citizens' juries is one way to point to a group of citizens that have been engaged over 6 weeks to say, they concluded this, we're going to go ahead with that, and all you others, each people who have an issue with it, well, I'm sorry, your opportunity to engage has now passed. So, I mean, but that citizens' jury process occurred during plan making. And again, it's really easy to engage citizens during plan making. It's really easy to come up with really cool, innovative tools for engagement because there's not a whole lot at stake at that point in time. It becomes a lot more contested and more political once you get to a point of prioritization and then investment decisions. And that's where we need more innovation in terms of engagement with citizens. And I don't think we're going to find best practice examples of that here in Victoria, unfortunately. I mean, there are best practice examples of that in other places around the world, and I would encourage you to have a look at Canada, and I'd be happy to talk about what's happening in Canada. But yeah, unfortunately here, maybe it's because of what's happened this last week. You've caught me at a very cynical time. Yeah. But with respect to Canada, I mean, again, they do better planning. I mean, the transport planning academics there, like Maddie Semiataki, would argue the case that it's bad planning, but these things are always on a sliding scale, right? And so relative to Melbourne, it's much better because there's stages in the discussion. There's a direct connection to strategic plans, which have existed for 10 years, so have survived changes in politics and government and leadership. These things are consistent. And so there's a degree of understanding of what the ambition is for these regions. So citizens can engage and make accountable the leaders who might have a different vision that which may sit in tension with the policy rhetoric. And they can say, well, hold on, this is different because it hasn't changed so quickly. I mean, not everyone knows. I'm sure if I talk to my parents, they have no idea. But people who are passionate about their cities, which is the kind of people that I study, they would be all across that, and they would be very quick to dissent. We also have a very active business community in Canadian cities. So we just had the Toronto Board of Trade come forward with a proposal to amend the governance structure of Metrolinx, which is the major integrated transport authority for the region, for Toronto, in aligned with how the region is being shaped, which is it's becoming a mega region. So kind of stuff that James talks about in his work. So I mean, that's the level of engagement, positive engagement happening in the community there outside of strategic planning. And I mean, that's a good sign, a very active civil society.
Crystal, because in the course of the conversation, you have brought this point several times, is this notion of the lack of an overall transport planning. And I'd like to hear your comments on that. Why do you think it's so?
Why has it gotten to this point?
Why there is not a general framework against which elaborate the discussion, you know, because otherwise you have a base-to-base project discussion, which easily, as you have presented, can fall prey to, you know, rather speculative project, short-sighted, blah blah. So if you don't have an overall or an overarching aspiration, it's very difficult to have a more rational debate. So why do you think there is no interest on developing this general framework? There isn't conditions. Why do you think this is the situation at this point?
Yeah, look, I think, well, one is there is a body of legislation called the Transport Integration Act, which sets out what should constitute good transportation planning. But that legislative framework just doesn't get engaged with or enacted. And so there's a legal question at play here, the extent to which our current government can be brought to account through a legal process so that they can do planning in alignment with the legislative framework that's there. But that process hasn't commenced yet. I'm not too sure if it will, but that's one way in which you can maybe change that relationship. I think there's different ways in which, I mean, our bureaucracies, our government agencies have gone through a period of retrenchment over several decades. And so a lot of the institutional memory and expertise that was once embedded within government has now gone to the private sector and into consultancies. So we've also seen a fracture between the political tier of governments who are ministers and who advises them, which is mostly their political advisors, less the government.
Not technical advisors.
Technical advisors, that's right, yeah. And so decisions continue to get clouded in political terms, and they talk about optics. You know, how's this project going to be received and seen in the community and by our base, our political base. And I think they've just gotten away with it. I mean, it's this proverbial sort of boiling pot with the frog in it. I mean, there's a lot of literature that's now coming out to say that the problem that we're now seeing is systemic, it's historical, and it's institutional, and it's now become embodied. And so to do transport planning in a different way would be such a structural and ontological shift at this point in time that it would be quite a lot of work to make that possible. And that's why I like to study the role of the academics, because, I mean, we teach this stuff in our classroom. So we've got a stake in this because we want our students to go in and be great transport planners. But we've also, in the context of transport planning, the last thing I have to say is that it's dominated by engineers. So even if we are working with young, idealistic future transport planners, they're also confronted with the engineering regime, which has a different view on how transport planning is done in terms of four-step modeling apparatus. So the tools that are employed to do transportation planning are themselves quite archaic and don't reflect the changing community and the changing values within our community.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for this opportunity. Are there any other questions or at this stage? Yeah?
I don't have any more questions, Juan.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to thank you very much, Crystal, for your time. I think you have brought to our attention many points that are relevant to our context. Again, these ideas such as the opacity of the debate, or not bringing to public discussion projects that have very big relevance or impact to the communities. The idea of how infrastructural projects that have been in a way built in the past have a way to condition the future, how infrastructure projects can be mechanisms of concentration or redistribution of wealth, and also political and technical debate and community participation, which are all extremely useful notions and considerations to our project and to the case studies that we are researching about. So thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you very much. It's really fun to be on the other side. I'm usually the one doing the interviewing myself, so this is cool. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, and thank you, James, again for the help.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you, Crystal.
You're welcome.